There are loyalties that run deeper than logic can explain. That October night in Loveland, Colorado, when the customer walked into the Copper Mule wearing a vintage Sega Genesis shirt, I felt my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the thin mountain air. The televisions behind my bar flickered between channels without anyone touching the remote, cycling through Knicks games, Ducks highlights, and Ravens coverage in rapid succession. The customer looked at me with an expression that suggested he knew exactly why those screens were misbehaving. He told me his name was Everett Thorne, and he had been looking for me specifically because bartenders who make promises to video games tend to attract a particular kind of attention. My name is Jason Fox, and I have been pouring drinks in bars across America for over 2 decades. I have listened to thousands of confessions, witnessed countless moments of joy and despair, served drinks to people at their absolute best and worst. But this story is not about a customer. This one is about me, about the teams I chose when I was young, and about what happens when you try to add a third loyalty to a foundation that was only built for 2. Before we continue, I would like to know, what state are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or state in the comments below. I love knowing these stories reach people all across the country, especially fellow sports fans who understand how deeply team loyalty can root itself in your identity. All right, back to that October evening. To understand what was happening to me, you need to know where my sports allegiances came from. Back in the early 90s, when I was a teenager in Sioux City, Iowa, I spent every spare dollar at the arcade downtown. 2 games dominated my life in those years: NBA Jam and NHL '94. The Knicks became my team because Patrick Ewing was absolutely unstoppable in NBA Jam, a digital force of nature who could dunk from half court and block shots that defied physics. I must have played 500 games with the Knicks, maybe more, feeding quarters into that machine until the orange and blue color scheme burned itself permanently into my brain. The Ducks came from NHL '94 on Sega Genesis. The Mighty Ducks of Anaheim had just entered the league, and their teal jerseys looked incredible on the 16-bit graphics. Paul Carria's speed rating made him impossible to defend against. I played entire seasons with that team, learned every player's strengths, memorized line combinations that only existed in pixels. Those teams became part of my identity during formative years, when your brain is wiring itself for adulthood. The Knicks and Ducks were not just entertainment. They were who I was. I made a promise to myself during those arcade days, the kind of dramatic oath that teenagers make when everything feels enormous and permanent. Whatever teams I chose in those games would be my teams forever. Through wins and losses, through championship runs and rebuilding years, through moves to new cities and changes in my life circumstances. The promise felt important then, like I was deciding something fundamental about my character. Looking back, I had no idea how literally that promise would be enforced. The years passed. I graduated high school, bounced around various jobs, eventually found my way into restaurant and bar work in 2002. The Knicks gave me decades of frustration, brief moments of hope crushed by playoff disappointments and terrible front office decisions. The Ducks actually won a Stanley Cup in 2007, which provided one perfect season of validation. My loyalty never wavered. I wore Knicks gear proudly through their worst seasons. I defended the Ducks to hockey fans who dismissed them as a Disney marketing gimmick. The teams I had chosen as a kid remained my teams as I moved into my 20s, then 30s, building a career behind various bars across the Midwest. The third loyalty came later in my early 40s, and it came from a place of genuine friendship rather than video game immersion. My closest friend from childhood, Ramon Delgado, had moved to Baltimore in his 20s chasing better work opportunities. We stayed close despite the distance, regular phone calls and occasional visits maintaining a connection that distance could not break. But I watched Ramon struggle with depression and isolation in a city where he knew few people. The move had been harder on him than he admitted, and I could hear the loneliness in his voice during our conversations. When the Baltimore Ravens won the Super Bowl in 2013, Ramon called me at 2 a.m, drunk and happier than I had heard him sound in years. He went on for 30 minutes about the game, about the celebrations in the streets, about finally feeling connected to Baltimore in a way he had not experienced before. The Ravens gave him community, identity, a reason to feel like he belonged in a city that had felt foreign for so long. Supporting that team became his anchor, and I wanted to support him. So I started following the Ravens, not obsessively like my Knicks and Ducks devotion, but genuinely. I learned the roster, watched their games when I could, bought a jersey, engaged with Ramon about their season. It felt like a way to participate in his happiness from 800 miles away, to share something important to him even though we lived in different cities. The Ravens became my football team not because of childhood promises or video game bonds, but because supporting them meant supporting my best friend. For 2 years, nothing seemed wrong with this arrangement. I followed 3 teams across 3 sports, maintained my Knicks and Ducks loyalty while adding Ravens fandom. Ramon and I had something new to discuss during our calls. My life continued normally. I worked my way up to management positions, moved from Iowa to Nebraska to Colorado, built relationships and routines in each new city. The triple loyalty felt natural, sustainable, unproblematic. The first sign that something was wrong came in September of this year, 3 months before Everett Thorne walked into my bar in Loveland. I woke up one morning to find my television playing NHL 94, the Sega Genesis version from my teenage years. The console was not connected. I did not even own a Genesis anymore. Yet there on my screen, rendered in perfect period-accurate 16-bit graphics, the Anaheim Ducks were playing against a team that should not exist in that game's universe. The Baltimore Ravens, impossibly present in a hockey game, defeating my Ducks by a score that grew more lopsided as I watched. I thought I was having some kind of stress hallucination, maybe a dream that felt more real than it should. I turned off the television and went about my day, dismissing the incident as my brain playing tricks after a late night at the bar. But it happened again the next morning, and the morning after that. Always the same scenario. NHL 94 playing on a disconnected console, the Ravens inexplicably appearing in hockey form, dominating the Ducks in ways that should not be possible. The pattern expanded. I started finding my Ducks jerseys torn and damaged, shredded as if attacked by animals, even though nothing else in my closet was touched. My Knicks memorabilia began falling off walls in the middle of the night, frames crashing to the floor without explanation. At work, the televisions at the Copper Mule would malfunction whenever I walked past them, flickering between channels or displaying static that other staff members did not seem to notice. Something was wrong, and it was getting worse. The psychological toll accumulated quickly. I started sleeping poorly, plagued by dreams where pixelated athletes accused me of betrayal, where video game announcers declared me disloyal in digitized voices that echoed through impossible arenas. I became jumpy, distracted, unable to focus on normal tasks. My staff at the Copper Mule noticed the change in my behavior, asked if everything was all right, expressed concern that I seemed unlike myself. I had no explanation to offer them, no way to describe what was happening without sounding like I was experiencing a mental breakdown. That brings us to October, to Everett Thorne, walking into my bar, wearing that Sega Genesis shirt. He sat down, ordered a beer, and watched me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. When I served his drink, he asked me a question so specific that I nearly dropped the glass. He wanted to know if I had recently added a third sports team to 2 childhood loyalties. He wanted to know if strange things had been happening to me, manifestations involving old video games and damaged memorabilia. I could not hide my shock. The question was too targeted, too precise to be coincidence. He explained that he worked as a researcher studying emergent phenomena related to early gaming culture, specifically the psychological and potentially metaphysical effects of intense video game immersion during developmental years. He had been tracking cases of people who experienced supernatural consequences after deviating from sports loyalties declared during the early console and arcade era. My situation, he said, fit a pattern he had documented across multiple cases. According to Everett's research, the intensity of engagement during those formative gaming years created neural pathways that went beyond normal fan loyalty. The thousands of hours spent in flow states, controlling pixelated representations of real teams, forged connections between personal identity and those digital avatars. For some people, myself included apparently, those connections became more than metaphorical. They became binding and forcible through mechanisms that conventional psychology could not explain. The problem was not that I had added a third team. The problem was that I had built my identity foundation on 2 pillars, Knicks and Ducks, during the specific developmental window when my brain was wiring itself for adulthood. Those 2 teams occupied spaces in my psyche that had calcified over decades of reinforcement. Adding the Ravens created structural instability, like building a third supporting column under a bridge that was only engineered for two. The metaphysical architecture could not accommodate the addition without threatening collapse. Everett had brought case files with him, printed research from academic journals I had never heard of, documenting similar situations. A woman in Gulfport named Catalina Parra, who declared loyalty to the Bulls through NBA Jam and the Braves through a baseball game on Super Nintendo, then tried adding the Saints when she moved to Mississippi. She experienced severe panic attacks and recurring nightmares until she abandoned the third team. A man in Hot Springs named Luka Kowalski, who swore fidelity to the 49ers through an old football game and the Red Wings through NHL '94, then attempted adding the Astros after moving to Arkansas. His apartment was plagued by poltergeist activity until he recommitted to his original two teams. The pattern held across every case Everett had documented. Two teams established during the formative gaming years, always from different sports, created stable identity structures. Attempting to add a third from yet another sport triggered supernatural rejection, manifestations designed to force correction of the perceived imbalance. The only documented solutions involved either abandoning the third loyalty or finding someone who had witnessed the original declarations and obtaining their release from the two-team limitation. That second option seemed impossible. My original gaming promises had been made to myself, alone in arcades and in my childhood bedroom, with no witnesses present. There was nobody who could release me from those oaths because nobody else had been there when I made them. Abandoning the Ravens meant abandoning my support for Ramon, withdrawing from something that had genuinely helped my best friend during difficult years. Neither choice felt acceptable. Everett stayed at the Copper Mule until closing that night, and we discussed potential approaches to my situation. He had never encountered a case where the third loyalty came from genuine altruistic motivation rather than casual bandwagoning or geographic convenience. Most people who triggered the supernatural rejection had added third teams for superficial reasons, supporting a winner, following a significant other's preferences, adopting a local team without real emotional investment. My Ravens fandom was different. It was rooted in friendship, in wanting to support someone I cared about, in participating in something that brought Ramon joy and community. Everett theorized that intention might matter in ways his previous cases had not revealed. If the metaphysical enforcement mechanism was responding to perceived betrayal or disloyalty, perhaps demonstrating the purity of my Raven's motivation could satisfy whatever force was generating the manifestations. We decided to attempt a ritual, an acknowledgement ceremony where I would formally explain my three-team structure to the universe or whatever entity was paying attention, making clear that the Ravens addition was not betrayal, but expansion rooted in love for a friend. The ritual took place in the Copper Mule after hours, just Everett and myself in the empty bar. I spoke aloud, addressing nobody visible but feeling like something was listening. I detailed my Knicks and Ducks history, the arcade days and Genesis nights, the promises I made and kept across decades. I explained Ramon's situation, his struggles in Baltimore, the way the Ravens gave him connection and identity. I declared my Ravens support as an act of friendship rather than disloyalty, a third loyalty that honored rather than diminished the first two. Nothing dramatic happened during the ritual itself. No temperature changes, no flickering lights, no supernatural confirmation. We finished, locked up the bar, and went our separate ways with no clear sense whether the attempt had accomplished anything. I drove home exhausted and uncertain, wondering if I was participating in elaborate delusion rather than addressing a real phenomenon. The manifestations stopped that night. Completely. The television remained normal. No more impossible video game broadcasts. My memorabilia stayed intact on walls and shelves. The dreams ceased, replaced by regular dreamless sleep. The feeling of being watched and judged, which had been my constant companion for months, disappeared. Whatever force had been generating the supernatural rejection had apparently accepted my explanation. The Ravens could stay. My three-team structure was valid. I called Ramon the next day and told him an edited version of the story, leaving out the supernatural elements but making clear how important his friendship was to me, how supporting the Ravens had become meaningful beyond just football. He seemed moved by the conversation, thanked me for caring about his life from so far away. Our friendship deepened through that exchange, became more explicitly acknowledged rather than assumed. Everett checked in with me periodically over the following weeks, documenting my case as the first successful resolution involving a third-team addition. His research suggested that the metaphysical enforcement was not mindlessly rigid, that it could accommodate expansion when motivation was pure and clearly demonstrated. My situation had revealed flexibility in a system that previous cases had made seem absolutely intractable. 3 months later, I still follow all 3 teams. The Knicks continue their tradition of crushing disappointment. The Ducks are mediocre, the Ravens are having a solid season, and every win makes Ramon happy, which makes me happy. The supernatural manifestations have not returned. My triple loyalty remains stable, accepted, unproblematic. But I think about the mechanism a lot. What force was monitoring my video game era promises, enforcing commitments I made as a teenager? What intelligence was sophisticated enough to evaluate my intentions and determine that my Ravens fandom was acceptable? The questions have no answers that make sense within conventional understanding of reality. I can only report what happened, what I experienced, what stopped happening after I explained myself to empty air in a closed bar. Does loyalty operate on levels we do not fully understand? Can promises made during formative years, in contexts that seem trivial, create bonds that persist and demand acknowledgement across decades? My experience suggests yes, though I wish I understood the mechanics better. I followed the rules I was supposed to follow, and when I deviated with pure intention, the system accommodated rather than punished. I consider myself fortunate. Have you ever made promises to yourself that seemed harmless but stuck with you far longer than they should? Felt bound to decisions from your youth in ways you cannot fully explain? Maybe there are enforcement mechanisms we do not see, patterns we participate in without realizing their depth. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone, and your experiences might reveal patterns that help others understand what they are going through. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, experiences that blur the line between sports culture and something stranger, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. The bar keeps teaching me that reality has more layers than we acknowledge in daily conversation, and I plan to keep sharing what I learn. See you in the next story, if you are ready to question what loyalty really means.